Hi, I am Dr. Mary Ehrenworth and the author of Vocabulary Connections, a structured approach to deepening students' academic and expressive language. Thank you to Stenhouse and to my fabulous editor, Terry Thompson, and to everyone at Stenhouse for publishing this book, which I'm really happy with. It's one of the books I'm most proud of. Um, and this book reflects about 3 years of research. And I just want to name that I taught and worked at Teachers College for about 20 years at Columbia University. And then for the last 3 years, my work has really focused on global literacy. And I work in everywhere from refugee camps to international schools to independent schools to public school districts. And everywhere, children love to learn language. They love to learn new words. And regardless of their current stage of language acquisition, they are able to learn new words. So we are today going to look at pedagogy. We'll look at some structures and we'll look at how to fit this work into existing curriculum. There are resources I can share for a minute that a couple places that might be helpful for you would be the website that goes with the book. The book is, I think, really tried to put the resources that you'll need inside the book. And if you want some of the downloadables or printables that you might want for your classroom, such as list of cognate collections that you can cut up or compound word lists, you can find them on the website vocabularyconnections.org. And if you wanted to get a hold of me, you can always get a hold of me at ehrenworthliteracyinnovations.org. ehrenworthliteracyinnovations.org. Thank you. So, what I'd love to do with you now is to think for a minute about all the ways that we can build on research when we're planning vocabulary. And when we're doing that, one of the things that we want to think about is we want to think a little bit about who are the researchers that we're building on and who are the researchers that we're looking towards. So we're going to look particularly towards these researchers, and I just want to name them for a second. Freddie Hebert, who is one of the leading linguists in the world. She does incredibly powerful work with the history of language. Nell Duke and Dave Pearson, who are some of the most important scholars in reading comprehension and reading and teaching reading. Ulfido Garcia, who has done incredible work on translanguaging and on language acquisition. And Sonia Cabell, whose work is really focusing on equity and on the need for us to have direct instruction. So just to name a little bit of some of this research, some of the things that I think have made the biggest difference for me have been that when I was a new teacher, I think I thought that my kids would learn vocabulary just as they learned reading. Like as they learned to read, the books would teach them words. And that is true. Nell Duke has shown and Dave Pearson have shown that good nonfiction texts will teach kids words. And that as they learn words, they're actually learning concepts because nonfiction vocabulary is, in fact, nonfiction. That's nonfiction concepts. But it's also true that we can't leave vocabulary and the knowledge building that comes with vocabulary to simply incidental learning. We have to make sure that kids get direct instruction too, because otherwise it's not fair. We're leaving this to kids who are already reading at high levels and hoping that that will then sustain their vocabulary acquisition. So we are, in fact, going today to look closely at not only incidental learning, which is when kids learn vocabulary from the books they read, but also at direct instruction, which is when we directly teach them vocabulary and ways to collect and learn vocabulary. Along the way, it's always interesting to think about what words you want to teach. And when we're thinking about what words we want to teach, it is really helpful to think about tier one, tier two, and tier three words, which goes back to Isabel Beck's idea of tiers of vocabulary, with tier one words being social language, which surprisingly, we don't really need to teach. Kids will learn that in the playground and they'll learn it in the cafeteria and they'll learn it on the playing field. Whereas tier two, which is specialized language, that we do want to really focus on because those are words that in shifting the balance, which I love, the authors speak about that as getting the most bang for your buck because the words are specialized, they're precise, but they're also I'm sorry, they're particularly precise, but in with these precise words, they will come up again and again in the next thing that you'll read. And so that's really, really helpful. As compared to tier three words, which are rare and particularly specialized, as in these would be words like if tier one word is small and tier two word is minuscule, tier three word might be subatomic. And so those are going to come up inside of your content studies. But I will say that my research at least has shown in classrooms that when kids are in content studies that they they adore and that they find fascinating, they can learn an extraordinary number of tier three words. Like you will find second graders using words like exoskeleton and thorax and antennae when they're researching insects because they've watched nature videos and they've heard those words and they've read books and they've seen those words and they've watched insects and they've labeled them. And within 2 or 3 days, they have this incredibly expert vocabulary. So the one thing that I think we should say as well about just when you're thinking about how research might inform how you structure your curriculum is let's just think about getting to all the parts of it because some of it will fit naturally inside of your curriculum and some of it you might have to do a little bit of sculpting around. So I think about in the book, this in vocabulary connections, we really lay out how to teach literary vocabulary. So these are going to be the words that you use to talk about characters and about stories. And you can mostly attach that to read aloud, to the work you're already probably doing with read aloud, and to the work that kids are doing in book clubs or partner reading. Then there's domain vocabulary, which is the expert content vocabulary that comes with content studies. And those too, nicely, you'll be able to fit that work into your existing curriculum if you're doing content studies, science and social studies and nonfiction studies. And then there's the notion of word consciousness. And with word consciousness, that is the one place where you probably have to do some additional work to fit it in, because this is about cognates and compound words and morphology. It's etymology. It's the history of language. Children adore it, which is really beautiful. But it doesn't just fit into read aloud or it doesn't just fit into your content studies. You'd probably need to fit 10 to 15 minutes once or twice a week. And you'd want to plan that work with your colleagues so it becomes cohesive. And we will look at that. All right, so that is some of the research that will undergird this work. So let's do some work together with collecting and teaching literary vocabulary. And what's really beautiful about this work is you can tuck it into your existing read aloud work, and you should get really specific transfer over to when kids are in book clubs or in partner reading and also even independent reading. One thing I'll say in the beginning is it's going to be important that you're jotting words, that you have visual cues for kids of the words that we're speaking out loud. And if you're working with younger kids, that might be an interactive chart that you're doing it together, and occasionally maybe they would add to it. And if it's with older kids, they could have their notebooks, assuming you've got some kind of reading journal or reading notebook, they can have that open and could be doing their own jotting or working with a partner while you're also creating a classroom collection. So a couple theories undergird this work. So one is whether your kids are reading, Yasmin, or they're reading like Tia Lola early chapter books, or they're reading the Poet X, or they're reading The Catcher in the Rye. That the words that are going to matter the most for literary vocabulary are not the words that are in the text. They are the words that are being used to talk about the text. And so, what that is that turns out to be words that are mostly about character traits and emotions. Sometimes they're words that you can also use to talk about the setting. So, when we do this work, you're going to create a vocabulary collection that the kids will pretty quickly, they're not memorizing these words, but pretty quickly they begin to acquire them, and they acquire them through context and through usage. So all of the vocabulary work we're going to do together, and that's laid out in vocabulary collections, is about learning vocabulary in context so that it has meaning for kids. So to do this work, I suggest that when you first start it, to be the most inclusive and the most democratic, and to support your multilingual learners as well as your readers of all letter levels, that you will start with digital text. So I would suggest a video such as a great Pixar narrative or any kind of digital video that you love. There's some Disney ones. That the Pixar ones are beautiful, but there's a lot of them from around the world now that are really gorgeous. So we're going to start with one with a service. They train service dogs, and they're really, really generous about sharing their videos. So we're going to start with one that's called Andy, a Dog's Tale. And we're just going to do a little work with there, and then we'll unpack some of the pedagogy around it. So let's imagine that you're working with kids, and it might sound something like, so readers, we're going to do some work today where we are coming up with ideas about characters. So we're inferring and thinking about characters, paying attention to details in the text. And inside of that, we're going to collect words to describe those characters. And as we collect those words, you're going to see that you're going to have more theories about the characters. So let's think for a minute how you might set up your notes. For instance, my notes might look a little bit like this. where I'm setting my notes up where the main character's name is Andy. So I've got a post-it just with him. And then I'm putting some blank post-its, and that's so we'll be able to sort them and move them around and be able to do that work. And teachers, if you were teaching young children, you might just have a couple of post-its, 3 or 4. If you're teaching older students, you're going to end up, I'm not joking, with somewhere between like 10 and 20, because it's amazing how many words come up to describe characters. So I'm going to start with some post-its here. And what we're going to do is we're going to watch the beginning of this text. And that what I would say to kids is 2 tips. One tip I have for you as a reader is that the author is never going to say to you, and so this shows that deep down Pip was sad. You'd have to pay attention to small details to figure that out. And that's what's so cool is you become the kind of reader who sees secret in the text that other readers would miss. And then the second tip I'll give you is the characters in the stories you're reading are more than one way. The fancy word for that is multifaceted. And so you're going to want a lot of different post-its or sticky notes here to describe your characters. All right. So let's give this a try. And then, friends, what we're going to do now is we're going to go to our text. So we're not going to watch this whole thing because I'm just going to give you a micro demonstration. But let's imagine now that we are about to watch a little bit of this text on about Andy. And this is Andy right here. He's the little puppy in the middle of all the puppies. Would you two be thinking, what words would you be jotting down? What words would you hope your students would be jotting down? So ready? And as the kids do this work, you're kind of voicing over because that helps them get started with it. So let's try that for a second. I'll demo. We pause there with the kids. Okay, so we might pause right there. And friends, that's where it's worth not only saying that I would probably jot down that he seems, that he seems sad and he seems lonely. So I'm going to jot those words down, and you would too. But then you also want to demonstrate actively what makes you say that, because that's where you are paying attention to small details in the text. So I might say he seems sad, he seems lonely. The kids will often call out, he seems disappointed. And so see how we've only watched or read a minute of this text and we already have words. So let's just go back to the text for a minute and let's just go look at his face for a minute. And then we might say, yeah, the way his ears go down and the way his eyes look droopy and the way he looks like his eyes are filling up with tears, those all make it seem like he's sad and he's lonely and he's disappointed. The way he's the only puppy left in the box. So see what we're doing. And then, friends, we'd go on and we'd watch a little bit more. I'm going to go forward a little bit, and you can see a little bit of as Andy grows and he's training to be, he wants to be a service dog. That's what this trainer does. Let's find out what words you would use to describe him. Okay. Oh, very energetic. Oh. Okay, so then you pause, and you have the kids talk with a partner, and first, what words do you have? And they share their words, and then you can feel free to teach them some words. So they'll often say things like, for instance, let me just show you. They'll often have said, "Oh, he seems really excited," right? From the way he jumps around and is so playful. And maybe I'd jot that word down. And as we jot some of these words down, so we've got, he seems excited and he seems playful. I'll teach you a kind of fancy word for that, which is energetic, which is when you have a lot of bouncy energy. Some of you are very energetic when you run out for recess. Some of you said he seemed kind of scared when the vacuum came. So teachers notice I'm giving an example from the text every time. So he seems kind of scared when the vacuum came. And I'll teach you another fancy word for that, which is apprehensive, which is when you're like a little afraid of a specific thing. And if the vacuum is really kind of bullying him, we might even say that he's intimidated. And then I love, and here's teachers where you can call kids in by name. You could say, like, I love the way Sarah said that he seems inspired. And that work, friends, if you, this is one of my favorite professional development books. It's Jaleel Howard and Tanya Milner McCall and Tyrone Howard. I love all of Tyrone Howard's work. It's about teaching, no more teaching with kids without positive relationships. And part of what they're teaching inside of this is this notion that you can call kids in, you can role play them into academic identities. So as you're teaching some words, and remember, you're not expecting kids to memorize these words, but now they attach them to their understanding of Andy. And then let's imagine we go through, and this story is amazing. There's a lot of character change, and you can do a lot of really serious character work in it, no matter how old your kids are. So then you end up with this rich list of all the words to describe Andy. So now let's imagine the next day we're going to do another read aloud. Maybe we're going to watch Joy and Heron, and we can say, is Joy or Heron or either of these characters sort of more like Andy? And it's interesting because at the beginning of the Joy and Heron video, which is a gorgeous Pixar video, Joy is a lot like Andy at the beginning of the story, very open and friendly. But then there's a period where there's another character, Heron, who's very naughty. And there's a period in Andy's life where he's pretty naughty. He's pretty sassy and pretty naughty. And so you can start to do this work where you're comparing characters, and all the time you're collecting all these beautiful word lists. And once you have these word lists, then it can be, well, how do these characters compare to the characters in the stories you're reading? So is Yasmin more like Joy or more like Heron or more like Andy? Is Yasmin ever lonely? Is Yasmin ever scared? Is Yasmin ever excited? Is Yasmin ever nurturing? Is Yasmin ever caring? And of course, she's going to be all those things. We can go to Holden and Catcher in the Rye. Is he ever disappointed? Yes, he is. Is he ever lonely? Yes, he is. Is he ever sort of damaged the way that is true for for Andy? Yeah, these things are true of Holden too. And so part of what you get there is you get this great sense of that the words you use to collect around one character, you can begin to use to describe for other characters. So a few things for the pedagogy. One is start with really accessible text. I always start with digital videos because I feel like multimodal texts are some of the most inclusive and some of the most engaging text that you can include in your curriculum. Alexandra Roman and Lauren Gould and I have a chapter in here in multiliteracies and multimodality learning by design, about particularly doing this work that we're doing right now with multilingual learners. And it really is so helpful to start with these digital texts. You'll notice that text literally had no words, so we had to come up with the words, and the kids can say them out. They can call them out in their different languages. And this is where AI is such a friend for you. If I have a newcomer who's speaking Ukrainian straight from Ukraine, and now I can actually do this work. They can watch this video and they could jot words in Ukraine, and we can use AI to translate those for me as a teacher and back into Ukrainian for the words that I'm writing. And the next thing you know, this kid is finding words in English and in Ukrainian. Then there's things that we can do, which I'll just name a few of them, but there's a few things that we can do to deepen and extend this work. And that there's a lot of them laid out in the books that you really have a whole curriculum for acquiring literary vocabulary. But a few of them that I think are really important is to get, this is why we collected on Post-its, is to get kids to begin to do some sorting. So sometimes they'll take these Post-its and they'll sort them between traits and emotions, or between what's inside and outside the character, or between characters' strengths and flaws. Sometimes we can do story mountains. We can begin to say, oh, how was Joy at the beginning of the story? At what moment did did we begin to see that she begins to be fierce? At what moment do we begin to feel that she's aggressive? And that work of change over time is also part to whole work. So again, there's a lot of these laid out in the book, but I think beginning to think about words to describe the characters and secret sides of characters and emotions versus traits and change over time. And then I do want to say just a word about verticals, because when you're doing literary vocabulary, this is so important. So a vertical, friends, is when you're thinking about what Freddie Hebert calls a semantic cluster, words that go together. And so we might have words like, well, all the words for scared. And so when Andy was being chased by that vacuum cleaner, was he a little scared, like nervous or apprehensive, or was he really scared, like terrified, or so scared that he couldn't even move, which would be petrified? And beginning to collect verticals for the major word groups is really, really helpful. And honestly, as soon as you get them in play, you'll start using them all the time. You'll find that your kids will use them during read aloud, and you'll use them during book clubs. If you're around and you have a somewhere near you, you have a paint store or a hardware store, these kind of paint chips can be really helpful if you and your kids can bring some home because they can collect them and use those for verticals too. And they like to think, what color would they use for the words for angry? What colors would they use for the words for kind? What colors would they use for the words for happy? And that's all sort of kinesthetic and visual work that gets them to begin to think about shades of meaning and about semantic clusters. And some of this, friends, then will also begin to affect how you think about the word walls in your classroom as well. So, for younger kids, we have a lot of word walls that are based on sounds and sound patterns. But that's going to change as the kids get older. And one of the things that we could think about then is we could think about what could your word walls look like for older kids, and definitely thinking a little bit about these verticals would be really, really helpful. So I'll just show you for a second. This is actually in the book on the lesson 4, which is on shades of meaning. And here you can see, here's a sample vertical. Here's another sample vertical. The kids can color them in with colored pencils, which they really like. Here's some that are in the book that are also available on the website that I've made. You can make them in Spanish, or you can make them in Ukrainian, and you can make them in English. It's really, now with AI, it's really easy. If you get stuck, you can email me. I like making verticals. And then just to show you what some of this looks like in a classroom, this is at George Davis Elementary School in New Rochelle. I love the teachers there are doing some really beautiful work, and she's really organized her word wall now so that it's celebrating and actively working with the vocabulary work that kids are doing. So let's pause there and let's for a minute think about what we've done so far and what we might want to do next. So with literary vocabulary, what we would probably do next, and this is deeply developed in the book, and it would be sort of too hard to do inside of one small webinar, would be that we would want to then develop children's writing and sketching about reading. And that gives kids more opportunities to use and develop these words. So they can be doing pressure maps, and they can be doing emotional timelines, and they can be doing perspective maps. And all of these will let them use this literary vocabulary. Again, they're not memorizing it, they're applying it. So you have it up, visibly in the room. You're using the words all the time. They're making collections, and you will be. It's just extraordinary to see how many words they begin to acquire and use. And then that starts to be some of your spelling as well, because then if you're using these words, then you might try to strive to spell them accurately. So we can be looking at how we would spell them. And it doesn't make any sense to be striving to spell words you don't use, but when you start using them, then it does. So it's a really beautiful pattern. So I hope that's helpful for you when you think about your literary vocabulary. I would be thinking about starting with digital text. Then I would move to some picture books so the kids still have picture support. And then I would move to chapter books or novels and do the work there as well. All right, friends, it's very, very joyful, and it's really supportive of your multilingual learners and all your readers of all different kinds. All right, thank you. Hey friends, let's do some work together with supporting children in collecting domain vocabulary, which is the expert vocabulary you learn when you're in a content study. And I'll just start by saying don't underestimate the remarkable number of words that kids can learn when they're in content studies. It's just incredible. And I will say that there are a few parameters that can really help with that. So for instance, it's really, really helpful if kids are studying content that they find fascinating. So when you've got books and videos and things that they're dying to watch and to read, then they're like sponges. They just begin to soak up so much knowledge. And then I think about having along with that multimodal text sets. So a really good text set, I think, has videos, it has print, it has text in more than one language if your kids are learning in more than one language, and AI can really help with that. Remember that all the knowledge they learn in one language will help them develop competency in another language, as well as knowledge building in another language. And so a good multimodal text set lets kids start with an accessible text, then move to a harder text, then move to a harder text. I always really like to have the kids in research clubs, whether they're second graders or 10th graders, because then they have reasons to take notes and to talk to each other, to teach each other about what they've learned. And if they're working towards authentic projects, that also really gives them reasons to build knowledge, to accumulate, to take notes, and to collect vocabulary, because they'll be thinking, when I go to teach someone else about this, what do I want to teach them about it? So when we were doing literary vocabulary, we did a lot of watching or reading of a text and then collecting words to describe the character. And the words weren't in the text. The words are the words we use to talk about the text. So what's interesting is in nonfiction books and print and video, the words will be in the text, and they tend to be words that are repeated or that the author gives an explanation for. So sometimes it's a scientific explanation and sometimes it's a historical explanation. And paying attention to those teaches your children how to also give historical explanations. So we're not looking for them usually to give definitions, which would privilege memorization. We're looking for them to give contextual explanations, so historical and scientific explanations. So let's try this for a moment. So there are two main techniques or structures to help children begin to collect domain vocabulary. One is going to be the simple act of sketching and labeling, and that is often the way I'll begin. When you're taking science notes or social studies notes, whether you're doing a flow chart or a timeline or you're doing an annotated diagram, most of your notes are going to have a sketch quality to it. And that labeling is actually the first way to begin to collect some vocabulary. And then you can begin to add captions to those labels, and you can begin to explain them to your colleagues, as in the kids in your research group. And that's going to get kids practice beginning to collect words in context and then explain them to each other. And one thing to note is it's not always hard words. Like some of the words will be hard if they're studying, insects. They're going to use words like exoskeleton. But the research group that's studying dragonflies might also have the word pond is really important because that's where dragonflies are going to breed and where they're going to hunt. And so it's not like they don't know the word pond, but explaining its significance in the life cycle of the dragonfly becomes important. And so you're going to make sure that kids are collecting not just hard words, but words that are important to this topic. And so if the first technique is really sketching and labeling, then the second will be to have a place where they can collect vocabulary, where they can still do some sorting of it. So I usually actually have them have envelopes that they can tuck into their notebook, where they can then take these out. They can take out all their words and they can lay them on the table and they can begin to do some conceptual mapping, conceptual sorts, and some semantic maps, which we'll look at, which is why you want to be able to move the words around a little bit. Whereas I used to do glossaries, and now I like to have something that's less static and that's more versatile that they can move. So let's just try a little bit of it. I think your modeling is really important here. You want to collect some words in front of the kids and with the kids and show them how together you'll learn more vocabulary than you would on your own. So don't just say to the kids like, wow, I got 8 words. I got all the hard words here. Instead, like you get a few of the words and then the kids can collect some words and then together you'll have caught some more. So let's just try a little bit. Let's imagine that we're a class and we're studying endangered animals. And one of the animals that we're going to be demonstrating with, at least for the teacher, for the read aloud portion of class, is going to be with manatees. The kids are then in a study of endangered animals and human impact. And together we're starting by studying manatees. It might sound something like, so readers, we're going to about to watch a video, a nature video about manatees. And maybe we'll watch it first without the narration so that you can just do some sketching and labeling of this manatee. You might not know all the words yet, but just by looking at the manatee, I bet you'll be able to think about what are some things you might label. And then we'll play the narration, which is going to be a scientist talking about the manatee. And it's as if you're in the undersea world with this scientist, and you'll see. So one of the things you can begin to do is not just sketch, but also do some thinking about what words feel important and try to attach them as labels to your sketching. So let's give this a try. And then, friends, I'm not going to do it all with you right now, but I actually do think it's really important to watch nature videos and science videos, and sometimes even history videos, first with the sound turned off so that kids get to preserve the wonder and really to act like naturalists. And they will have a lot of observations and theories and questions. And then you can turn on the narration, because the one thing about nonfiction is it's always telling kids what to think. And we want to give them a chance to wonder, to look at these images and to be in the natural world like that. So let's try this for a second. Let's go to the manatees and let's just imagine for a second that you've watched it for a second without the sound, and now we're going to watch a little bit with the sound. And let's just do a little sketching and labeling. I'll pause in a second. Let's try it for a second.
Manatees, also known as sea cows, are large, slow-moving animals that live in the rivers and marshy coastal areas.
So let's just pause there. And then we'd already do a little sketching. We learned that they live in rivers and coastal areas, marshy areas, shallow waters. They're large. They call them sea cows. So you could just see this already. And your kids, what's really great about this is your kids really quickly will already have some things that they want to add to a very quick sketch. And make sure that your sketch isn't too good, or else it's going to turn into huge art projects. These are meant to be note-taking strategies. So I've got my little manatee, and it might sound like with the kids, it feels to me like I think they said that he's swimming in shallow water, and so maybe I'll put that down here. We know that they're endangered, so I wonder if that shallow water is going to end up being important. I think they said that he's got poor eyesight, so I'm going to put the eye here. And it looked like he's got some kind of flipper watching him swim. I'll be curious to find out if he swims more with the flipper or more with the tail. And maybe the kids would have picked something else up. But for now, that's the beginning of our sketch. And then you two, and then you have the kids, you've got a sketch and they've got a sketch, and your sketch is kind of an implicit model. And then they're comparing with a partner or with a research club, and they're beginning to add more to it. So then let's just go on and watch a little bit more, and let's just see what else would we have picked up if we continued to learn about the manatee. Okay.
Of West Africa, the Amazon, the Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of Mexico. Manatees are aquatic mammals, which means that although they never leave the water where they live, they must come to the surface every few minutes to breathe air. Like all mammals, manatees are warm-blooded, feed their babies milk, and have hair. They may not look very hairy, but manatees have whisker-like hairs all over their bodies that help them sense movement in the water and feel different textures. Since manatees have very poor eyesight, this might help them find the right kind of food to eat. Manatees are herbivores, meaning they eat plants. They graze on underwater plants like sea grasses and algae for up to 8 hours a day, grabbing the plants and pulling them into their mouth with their prehensile upper lip. They need to eat a lot of food to fuel their huge bodies.
We'll stop there. So with manatees, just think for a second, what would your sketch look like? And then imagine that the kids are going on and adding to their sketches. It's really helpful if you have a document camera. I love document cameras, but you could do this with a smart screen, or you could do it on large chart paper. Any of those things would work. So then it might look a little bit like you're saying to the kids, so let's go back. And it seems to me like I'm ready to add some captions, like not just that the manatee has an eye, but that they have poor eyesight, or that they've got a tail, but the tail is how they really swim. It's almost like a motor. And I think we were beginning to be able to also do some categories of words, like all the things that are about why they're mammals. Some of you were saying that they are warm-blooded and they come to the surface for air. I'm curious, I didn't know that you had to have hair to be a mammal. Maybe the shallow water is turning out to be important for why they're endangered. Maybe that has to do with human impact. So teachers and friends, you see how you've now got a record in the room. And this is something that's really important, is that it can sometimes feel like we do these studies, but there's no record in the room of the content. I remember a few years ago when we were working with Phil Darrow and Marilyn Burns. They're both authors of the standards for math, the Common Core and global standards around math. And we visited a bunch of classrooms, and they were really encouraging teachers to have more records in the room of the math conversations, of literally the math work that had happened. And at the time, it really led me to think, Oh, we should have more records in the room of also the work that happens during read aloud or during our content studies. Like, where are the records so kids can go back to it? And if you had kids who spoke multiple languages, they could, of course, be labeling in Spanish or in Ukrainian or in Arabic or in Mandarin, and then doing some translating into English. And the next thing you know, the kids are developing this rich vocabulary. So then we could also think if they've got these notes that are on your chart paper that are also at the same time in their notes, and those notes begin to grow and become more complex, then they could also begin to keep a vocabulary collection. And let me just show you how we'll just, let's imagine there's four of us in a research group. Maybe you're one of my partners, and I put down the word endangered, and I'm going to add it to this collection. I want to add it to our manatee collection. Then I have to give an explanation of why. And so maybe I would say something about how, well, we learned that manatees are endangered, and it's making me wonder, like, what makes them so in danger? What are the reasons that they're so vulnerable? And I feel like I don't know yet, so I'm going to sort of put it over here and say I want to know more about it. And then maybe someone else in our club puts down the word sea cow, and they're going to explain how manatees are known as sea cows because they're so large. I think they weighed something like, what did they say, 1,200 pounds or something? And so we could agree that sea cow seems like an important term. And then this is, remember what I said about it's not just hard words? Maybe someone in our club has put down the word slow. And like that's going to be really important because it's going to turn out that because they're so slow, they're in danger from propellers. And because they're kind of slow and they said, they have to come to the surface to breathe, all of this makes them in danger and they're living on coastal waters. So see what's happening here is we can do a lot of scientific explanations, contextual explanations. And then we could also sort these. We could sort them into words we want to use in whatever we're going to write or if we're going to do a presentation. We could sort them into words we know and don't know. We could sort them into life cycle words. We could sort them into things that are positive for manatees and things that are negative for manatees. But what's going to happen then is every time as we do this work, we're doing contextual usage, right? We're doing some conceptual sorts. Maybe we're going to do some semantic maps where we lay these out and connect them. And we're beginning to really come to a deep understanding of these words as concepts, which is why Dave Pearson has talked about how when you collect nonfiction concepts and words, you're actually building knowledge, you're collecting knowledge. And that you'll just be amazed at how I usually say by the first day they're sketching and labeling, by the second and third day they're beginning to collect this vocabulary more formally, and that begins to mean that they just develop these really, really rich vocabulary collections. And let me pause just for a second, and I will show you what that looks like. I'll just take you to a page in the book because I think it's really interesting to see what kids do with some of this work. So here we go. This is in one of the lessons in the book where you can see Jenny, she's a great teacher. She's a second grade teacher at PS 158 in Manhattan, a beautiful teacher. The whole grade is amazing. Whole school is amazing. And here she's being really careful to just like, they watched a video on monarch butterflies and the kids called out that one of the important words was thorax. And so she's adding it to her very beautiful sketch. And then by the time they finish, she has all these different words that go with the monarch butterfly. And then look, these are second graders. Like that's a second grader going off and labeling their body parts. They're like, these are the body parts I think of a bee, it looks like. And look at the words. They've got abdomen and wings and thorax and eye and antennae, and it's the head and the legs. And it's just extraordinary. And they'll improve their accuracy and improve their spelling over time. Here's one with a climate change study. Here's another anatomy of a monarch butterfly from a young researcher, a young second grader. It's really beautiful. And what happens there, friends, is that this focusing on domain vocabulary gives your kids so much confidence because they can begin to talk about whatever their topic is, their research topic, with such expertise. It's really kind of extraordinary. So I think, one more thing that I'll just say about this, you can come to the book then, and there's just a lot of lessons on how to deepen kids' work with domain vocabulary, but I'll just name that some of the lessons that you'll see will be on the significance first of sketching and labeling, and then of collecting vocabulary, and then of doing conceptual sorts, and then of adding captions to your labels, and then teaching kids to teach others about the words and concepts. And then you're going to come, friends, to some work that's going to be really important, which is going to just matter about context clues. And let's just say a little bit about that. Is that when we say to kids that they should look at context clues, it's a little bit like sometimes we say to kids they should, capitalize proper nouns. And they're like, if they knew what those words were, they would do that. And it's a little bit the same, which is as your nonfiction becomes more sophisticated, the context clues also become more sophisticated. And I'm just going to show you, this is why I love to collect really good nonfiction to then demonstrate this work with kids so they then can become more powerful. Tim Shanahan has a great blog post on this too, where he talks about you don't want to predefine all these words for kids because what you want to teach them is how to figure out the words as they read or as they watch, and as they go from text to text. We want to make sure that they have agency and independence, that they become not codependent on us, waiting for us to define a word, but that they're going to expect that they'll go through a period of confusion and kind of apprenticeship in their knowledge, and then they'll gradually become more expert as they read more. So let's just take a look for a second at, this is one of a book that I use in my book because I love it so much. I love all her books. Marta Magellan and her brother Mauro Magellan, who does these incredible illustrations, and her husband James Gersing, who does these amazing nature photography. But in this book, Up, Up, Away, Monarch Butterflies, let's just take a look for a second and just think to yourself, how could you name or label some of the things that are happening here in terms of context clues? So we've got here, monarch butterflies are nature's wonder. Legend has it that early settlers to North America admired the monarch's bright orange color. It made them think of Prince William of Orange, who became a king. So they gave the butterfly the name of monarch, which means ruler or king. And that's what we would call really an embedded definition. And sometimes those are in parentheses, and sometimes those are with a little sidebar, but they're really helpful. But then it also has a really specific example. And that will, so if the kids are going to say, what is a monarch butterfly, then they need to practice being able to say it's a specific kind of butterfly that looks like this, that is orange and red, and it was named after a specific monarch, William of Orange, and they gave him that name because monarch means king, right? And then let's go for a different examples. So let's go find, let's see. Oh, so this is one of my favorites too, which is when you have these complicated. So as nonfiction becomes more sophisticated, the diagrams in the books, the visuals no longer make the book easier. They actually add, they layer in information. And one with that's a really good practice for kids is by the time they've read a text, they should be able to go back and explain the significance of some of the visuals. So here you can see this is nicely labeled. It's also got visual cues. It's the life cycle. And then it says down here, egg to butterfly life cycle, so that kids might not know yet what a larva was. But if you go up here, you can see that it starts as an egg, really here, it's really small. And then it's a caterpillar, which is also called a larva, which is when it's eating up on the leaves and beginning to move to its next stage, which is chrysalis or pupa here, and they could follow it along. And that's really, so this also is going to be another way that vocabulary is often explained, which is through annotated diagrams. And then you might also look at pretty sophisticated captions. So see what we're doing? Like it's just beautiful to just go through, like here you've got another embedded, see this embedded definition, a generation is a group of living things born around the same time. And what's interesting is if you look at these bold words, they are in fact in the back in a glossary. But typical of glossaries is that glossaries for sophisticated nonfiction often themselves have really hard words in them. So like if we look at like Mullerian mimicry, like mimicry in biology, a way unrelated organisms copy each other so that predators leave them alone. Well, they will have to go back to the part that has the section on copycats to learn more about this. Butterflies that look like monarchs so that they're copycats, which is going to be about mimicry. And then they're going to learn more about an imposter. So that there's this back and forthness of it. And I think, friends, that it is really important that rather than pre-teaching the words, which is really a way of doing an end run around teaching kids how to learn vocabulary, that we create meaningful opportunities for kids to learn how text teach them words. How do you learn vocabulary from a video? How do you have to rewind and replay and say, wait, that seemed important? How do you pause when they show a diagram? How do you get your notebook out and do a little sketching? If you're a young learner, how do you say back, oh, I'm going to teach my friend right now about two of these words that I just learned? And it is remarkable. Any person who knows, if you've ever talked to a 5-year-old who comes to school already comes to school, an expert on dinosaurs, and they will explain the difference between a velociraptor and a Tyrannosaurus Rex, or an herbivore, right, or an omnivore. And they're using Latin vocabulary and classification, and that's because they've read dozens of texts on dinosaurs, and maybe they've been to dinosaur museums and they watch videos on dinosaurs. And so they are voracious about words. It's a good word for vocabulary. They're voracious. They love their omnivores. And they need opportunities for it. And I don't think that the beautiful thing is to just say, here's the 3 words I want to teach you today, but instead you're going to read 4 books on butterflies and watch 3 different videos with me. And over the next 3 days, you're going to become an expert entomologist. That's a person who's expert on insects. And you will soon know more words about insects than most adults do in this country. And 4 days later, your second graders will, and they'll be able to teach your 8th graders about insects. It's really extraordinary. So let's just remember some of our key concepts here. Rich multimodal text sets, fascinating topics, time to stay inside of a content in a text set for more than a day, so that they actually are able to use those words from the easier text to then read a harder text and a harder text and a harder text. Places where they can collect that vocabulary, focusing not just on the hard words, but words that are important in that context, and taking note-taking pretty seriously. All of this is laid out in the book, so you get more examples of it, and at the website also there'll be more examples. But I think that content studies are some of the most important and beautiful aspects of our curriculum. And I encourage you to take vocabulary collection seriously, because vocabulary collection is really knowledge building. Okay, thank you. All right, friends, let's take a look together now at what I'm going to call in the book word consciousness, and others call it this also. And word consciousness, I think about, is teaching kids to be alert to how language works and to fall in love with words and language. We can be word conscious in English, but we can also be word conscious in Spanish and in Catalan and in French and in Arabic and in Mandarin and Ukrainian. And what's really beautiful is, especially with multilingual learners, is you can begin to think about how systems are the same and different across languages, so that as kids become more linguistically flexible, they also become more cognitively flexible. It's really beautiful. I think that the areas of word consciousness where you can do a little bit of work and it really pays off is going to be in cognates, in compound words, and in morphology, which is going to be Greek and Latin, mostly Latin, prefixes and suffixes and roots. To begin with, think to yourself, how will I explain, whichever language is the language that you're really teaching in your classroom, how will I explain a little bit of that language is linguistic history? And you can look it up. There's probably some great text. You could use AI to do some mapping. I did Phil and I, just my co-author of AI Enhanced Literacy, we're doing another new book on AI and reading, on democratizing reading with AI. And we had kids do linguistic history maps using AI, and it was really interesting. So, where are the places, and what are the languages they've spoken and their family has spoken, and in what places and when, and what does that mean about their cultural and linguistic heritage? It's really beautiful. So here, let's think first a little bit about how you might actually share with kids a little bit of linguistic history. So I think mapping is important. And here we'll do as an example, we'll do a little bit of mapping. This is in the book in chapter 3. Jenny did this great little visual map of the history of English. And it's interesting to just explain. Kids love this. I mean, she's got second and third graders explaining how very small the island of England is and was, and all the many influences, because it was an island surrounded by many other nations and peoples, that there were a lot of different influences on English. And that's one reason that English is such a complicated language. Like if we think about like Italian, where most of the words in Italian come from Latin, and the exceptions are words like computer, which are new words. But English, we think about, initially having indigenous languages and then a Roman occupation. So you began to get some influx of Latin, and then you get these Germanic settlements, which are Anglo-Saxon peoples who settle in England. And they're speaking essentially a form of German, first Proto-German and then German, and that's going to influence so much of English. That's where we get words like mother and father and cow and pig. They're Germanic, and we're speaking that Germanic language in England for a long, long time. And then there's Viking invasions and also Viking settlement in the north of England. So you begin to get some Norse influence, and then much more strongly a Norman French English, a Norman French influence when William the Conqueror comes over. And that's a fascinating thing to look at with kids about. I mean, I'm always interested in social studies to look at how linguistic histories are histories of power. And so this is a perfect example of where the ruling class is speaking French and the working class is speaking this Anglo-Saxon Germanic. And both of those are beginning to infiltrate and become part of what's going to be contemporary or modern English. And then there's a really strong infiltration through the Christian church, and you get a lot of Greek and a lot more of Latin coming in through education, through the people who are getting a Christian education. And then you get influx of language out through, sometimes really painful and harsh histories of imperialism and colonialism, where you're getting a language dominating and being sent out to dominate and subjugate. But then it's also permeated by the peoples in places that have been occupied. And so you get Hindi and Arabic and Persian and Turkish and indigenous languages coming back into English. And so one of the things that's really interesting about teaching kids about English, about the etymology or the history of English, is in fact how permeable it is. And I think that the kids understanding that English is a very fluid language that is changing all the time, as all languages are, and that they're part of that change. That the English that they're going to speak in 10 years will be different than the English that their parents spoke 20 years ago, and that's different than any English if their parents did speak English 30 or 40 years ago, and it's true for whatever languages they're speaking at home as well. Um, so a little bit of mapping and some timelining can be really interesting to do cultural maps and linguistic maps to get a sense of where the languages come from that are in play in your classroom. And the more you know about that, the more you can then lean into those languages too. If I know a child has Hindi and that Hindi is one of her languages, then I can make sure I use AI sometimes, just like, oh, the Hindi word for this would be, or your grandmother might know this word, and she'll be able to teach you more about it. So that we've got this interplay of we're all learning languages all the time. So meanwhile, then let's take a look at cognates. And if you teach multilingual learners, you definitely want to have looked at the work of Cardenas Hagen, who's one of the great scholars. But she has a chapter in there on cognates and just how cognates, which are words that share the etymology, they've got the same derivation, but they sound alike and they look alike across languages. So they share meaning, they share what they sound like, and they share what they look like. These words give kids so much power to figure out hundreds of words, and it's that same sense of instead of trying to memorize words, we're helping them become curious about words so that then they have agency over to how to figure out more words. So let's just try this. I'm going to show you a little bit of a cognate collection. This is one that's in the book that you can download and print. There's a bunch of them, but this one particularly there's words in French, there's words in Spanish, and there's words in English. And the first thing that kids might do with a partner is just do some sorting, like which words go together. They do that really quickly, faster than you might actually really believe. And then they can begin to come up with some theories, some noticing. So they'll begin to say things like, oh, and I begin to see like if I know that the English word is necessity, someone else might actually know the Spanish word necesidad, but even if they didn't, that where there's a Y in English, it looks like there's often a DAD in Spanish, and there's often a T with an apostrophe in French. And then they can go look to see, do they find another word like that? And oh, look, there's difficulty. That also has a Y in English. So then we're going to predict that it might have an AD, a TAD, and it does. It's not a DAD, it's a TAD, but it's very similar. And it's got a TE again, which just means that if I come across the word difficulty and I'm a Spanish speaker, I could probably say it's probably going to be dificultad. Maybe it'd be dificultad, but it's close enough that I could probably figure out the meaning. And then we could go over here and we could look at universidad and université and university and find out that it's the same. And then we could begin to have theories about when it ends in ION or when it ends in, let's find, impossible, impossible, impossible. Like that would be, it's super interesting. So what's really beautiful about cognates, friends, is the way that it gives kids so much power to figure out words. And when they are figuring out cognates, you can begin to organize your cognate lists so that they uh, they can be organized by maybe you want to do only the words that do end in Y for a while, or maybe you want to do only the words that end in LE for a while, or ION. And I like to do it when I do cognates with kids. You can do them in small groups so that it's just the words that kids actually like, the languages that they actually are learning at home and school, or between them. Like maybe I'm speaking English and my partner speaks more Spanish, and our other partner speaks more Catalan. But it's always fun too to introduce a new language, because what that does is it helps them really focus on theorizing. So, for instance, this last fall, I was lucky enough to be at Benjamin Franklin, which is a gorgeous international school in Barcelona. And the kids did, we made a cognate collection using AI to just very quickly figure out what are some of the most common cognates that run across Catalan, English, and Spanish. And this is where AI is your friend, because it can help you sort out what are the most common and then make a little list for you. And then you can go cut them up and put them out. And it was really fun because even kids who didn't speak Catalan yet could see patterns and begin to say, like, oh, maybe I could learn some of this Catalan really quickly, which they should because they live in Catalonia. And then some of the kids who were really fluent in Catalan were able to say, like, whoa, wait, I'm beginning to see that actually a lot of these words are similar in English. And now I can realize that there are systems for this. It's really empowering. It's really beautiful. So just say to yourself, when and where could you fit in a little bit of cognate work? And would it be small group work or would it be for the whole class? It is really helpful to know that there's great brain research that shows that, like, as kids become, again, more linguistically flexible, they become more cognitively flexible. It's really beautiful. Like, you can literally see their brains growing. So then let's take a look at compound words. So I also really love compound words. And I didn't really until I started researching vocabulary, and now I'm in love with them. So here's the thing about compound words. So compound words will be larger words that have smaller words inside of them. A lot of them actually were Anglo-Saxon, that were a lot of them were Germanic. And and you can, if anybody ever studies modern German or ancient German, you'll know that they put a lot of words together to make very, very big words. And so German is a fascinating language to study. So with compound words, you can go both directions. It's really beautiful to teach kids that you can figure out the meaning of a lot of words, of big words, by looking at the small words inside of them. So that's going to help your reading comprehension. You can figure out the spelling of bigger words by putting together smaller words, and that's going to help your spelling. So you can go big to small and small to big, and it's really beautiful. And I found that it was really helpful when I was learning about compound words with children to actually pause and name with children the kinds of compound words. Often I think kids don't need particularly technical vocabulary for these things, but this I think is in fact really helpful, is to be able to say that there are compound words where the words are connected. They're always joined by meaning. So you had sun and flower, you put those together, you get sunflower, and that is a closed compound because it's all one word, right? Or you could have a hyphenated compound. A lot of French words are hyphenated compounds, and that's where you took self and esteem, you put them together, and that means I've got self-esteem, esteem around myself, and it's got a hyphen in the middle. But you can also have open compounds, and sometimes it's helpful to remember that those are still compound words. So you could take ice and cream and put those together, and they become something different. They're neither ice nor cream. They are ice cream, related but slightly different. And that's an open compound. And there's a lot of different things that you can do with compound words. One of the ones that I think can be really fun is to do what we're going to call a compound relay. And you can fit this in the 2 minutes before kids are packing up for snack or packing up to go home. You can set your timer and you can say you've got 1 minute and you're going to write a word like snowball. And then kids can work in partnerships to try to figure out how many compounds they can go with that. Like maybe from snowball, we're going to go to baseball. And then maybe I might go to third base from that. And then maybe I'd go back to ball. And I might do basketball. And then maybe I might do football. And then maybe I want to go back to snow. And now I've got snowman. And then maybe that leads me to fireman, and that leads me to fire truck, and maybe that leads me to dump truck. And then I go back to fire, and I'm going to get to firestorm, and that's going to lead me to thunderstorm. And so the kids like, and then bam, you're like, you're stopping your timer, and it's been 1 minute, and you can count them up, and the kids can get a point for each word. And it seems really kind of silly, and it is silly, but kids love games, and I love word games. And the nice thing is, they just become much more aware of compound words. The next thing you know, you're reading aloud and they'll be saying, that's a compound word, or they're noticing it in their independent reading books and they begin to use it in their writing. And that's what we're looking for. That's what word consciousness is all about, is that kids become more aware and more curious. So you'll see there's a lot of really fun games in the book. I love to learn from teachers about how to be more playful and to lean into play theory in classrooms. And so sometimes it's the find all the small words and the big words. That can be really fun. Or you can have got word charts that you can cut up for kids, or you've got little words that you can cut up and then see how many of the bigger words they can make, or we can do compound relay like we just did, or you can play blank slate, which by the way is an actual game that you can buy for adults. It's really fun to have in your house, where it gives you one word, the small word, and then it gives you a space either before or after it, and you and your friends who are sitting around the table have to very quickly write on these mini whiteboards other words that go with it. So say we had like star and there's a space before it, then we each get a point if we get the same word. So maybe I say sea star and she says sea star, but he says superstar. Right? It's like, oh, okay, what comes before that? And then so it's just another way to do compound words, which I think are really beautiful. So let's just pause there for a second. You could be thinking, where could I fit in some of this compound word work? So, friends, let's then think for the last thing for word consciousness is to think about morphology, which again, you don't have to do very much of it to really get a lot out of it. Kids become so much more alert to the systems of language. It's really beautiful. And listen, English is complicated. So, on the one hand, when you study these maps and you study these timelines, you do realize that only about 50% of the English language is Greek. It comes from Greek and Latin. The rest does not, and which is why we have all these unusual spelling patterns. We have all these things that don't perfectly make sense. They do make sense. They're just following many different linguistic histories. But at the same time, 50% is still a lot. That's still a lot of words. And so understanding something about morphemes, which are going to be the smallest part of a word that carries meaning, or an easier thing to say to kids will be prefixes, which come at the beginning of a word and change the meaning, or suffixes, which come at the end of the word and change the meaning, or roots or bases, which are in the middle of the word and carry meaning. And that once you learn a few of these, it can actually really help you know literally hundreds of words, which is really, really cool. So there's some great research. I think Orton Gilliam have done great work with this. I love the work in Shifting the Balance around the significance of teaching morphology. Tim Shanahan has a great blog post on teaching morphology. So I do a whole chapter just on teaching morphology because I think it's so important. And I learned a lot of it from some of the teachers at PS 158, where there was some really brilliant morphology work happening. So let's just take a second for a minute to think how you might sort of do some of this work. You only might have, somewhere between 10 to 15 minutes to do some of it. And often what it's going to look like is it's going to look like I'm going to teach you, I'm going to write it down in a second, but first, because there's going to be a kinesthetic element for it, is you're thinking about, I'm going to say the word, the kids are going to write the word, they can write it on a whiteboard, they can write it in a word study notebook, they could write it in the palm of their hand. When I say the word, I mean the actual prefix word. Let's do prefixes first. So they're going to say the morpheme or the prefix, they're going to write the morpheme, they're going to have a movement for it. So let's imagine it might sound something like, young linguists, which I love to call kids linguists, use fancy words for them. So young linguists, we're going to be learning a prefix today, and you've learned that prefixes are the morphemes, the sounds that come at the beginning of a word and change the meaning. And the one that we're going to be using today, we're going to be learning today is re, R-E. It's usually pronounced re, R-E. And if we were going to write it be R-E, we could put it in our hand and it means back or again. And so I'm going to say sort of back or again. So let's say R-E, back or again, R-E, back or again, R-E, back or again. And then let's just think, you could be thinking, what are some of the words that you know that use this prefix? And for instance, let's think we're probably already thinking about, we often rewrite in this classroom. And then the kids will begin to call out. We often reread in this classroom and get them to give the example. We reread, we read something again. Sometimes we redo our work. So we're going to do that again. Sometimes we reuse our water bottles because we want to be careful to take care of the environment. And then the next thing you know, the kids are coming up with literally like a dozen words that have the word re. Sometimes you can have, it's helpful to have what we call non-examples. And that's where you're going to come up with words like, for instance, actually read, which that is not a prefix in there. And then you can explain how not all words that have RE is RE a prefix. And usually you can kind of explain a little bit about that. And the kids don't make a big fuss about it. You just tell them that. They're like, oh, okay. And you can decide how deeply you want to go with that. So what's really beautiful is if you then keep that piece of paper up on a word wall, so now you need a part of your word wall that is for morphology, the kids will then find those words in their independent reading. They'll use some of those words in their writing. And the next thing you know, that morphology work begins to really like take off like fire. And kids love it. It's you go to do this teaching, you think, okay, I'm going to teach you Latin prefixes today. I wonder how that's going to go. And they absolutely adore it. It's short, it's fast-paced, it's intense, and it has immediate payoff. So let me show you. Maybe I can just show you for a second. For instance, in the book, here's a picture of a teacher's morphology wall. And I really liked the way this teacher's sort of organizing it by prefixes. And then she's got bases or roots. And then she's got just examples underneath it of the ones that they've already learned. So kids can just turn to that morphology wall as a reminder of this is what we did last week. And this is what we'll do next. And this is what we're doing now. And so morphology gets you really, really far with word consciousness. So let's pause there. There's more to do. I think etymology and morphology is fascinating. And in the book, there's lessons on, for instance, names and how names carry power. And you could look at the linguistic histories of names if you want to do that in social studies. There's more that you can do with all of this. But the main thing is to say to yourself, where literary vocabulary work I could do inside of my read aloud and my maybe book club work, and my domain or content vocabulary I can do inside of my content studies. For word consciousness, to do cognates and morphology and a little bit of compound words, you do have to make a little time for it. So just you don't need that much time, but finding 10, sometimes 15 minutes, 10 would be enough though, one or two times a week. And then I would suggest planning with your colleagues so that it becomes cohesive. So instead of every fourth grade teacher doing whatever prefix she feels like it, you kind of think back, what did they learn when they were doing phonics in K1, 2? What do we want to reinforce in grade 3? What do we want to then reiterate and then move forward with in grade 4 so that you've got something cohesive going? Fortunately, kids don't mind a little repetition because they'll always have new words with all of these compound words and these morphemes and cognates. That's just you're teaching them a way to think about language. You're not getting them to memorize individual words. All right, friends, I hope that was helpful. Remember that you have many, many resources in the book, and that many teachers, many fabulous teachers donated student work and examples of their word walls and word ball collections, which was really beautiful. And you can also go to the website. Okay, vocabularyconnections.org. Thank you so much.